I'm Tom Morello, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name's Hannah Feldman. Steve Skrovan is off today, so I'm here, along with my co-host, David Feldman. Hello, David.
Good morning.
And, of course, the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hi, everybody. We're going to remember Jimmy Carter and why I think he was our last president as far as progressive civic groups are concerned.
Yes, today we're talking about the legacy of President Jimmy Carter, who passed away December 29th. Our first guest will be Douglas Brinkley, professor of history at Rice University, who has authored, co-authored, and edited more than 36 books on American history, including The Unfinished Presidency, Jimmy Carter's Journey Beyond the White House. And our second guest will be James Fallows, reporter and author who's written for The Atlantic magazine since the mid-1970s and who joined President Carter's 1976 campaign and went on to work as his chief speechwriter. They'll share their political insights about what made Jimmy Carter truly unique as a president, as well as some personal stories about what made him truly unique as a person. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our relentless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, Douglas Brinkley discusses Jimmy Carter's place in the American pantheon. David?
Douglas Brinkley is the Catherine Sanoff Brown Chair in Humanities and Professor of History at Rice University, presidential historian for the New York Historical Society, trustee of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Presidential Library, and a contributing editor at Vanity Fair. He has authored, co-authored, and edited more than 36 books on American history, including Silent Spring Revolution, John F. Kennedy, Rachel Carson, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, and the Great Environmental Awakening, Rosa Parks, A Life, and The Unfinished Presidency, Jimmy Carter's Journey Beyond the White House. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Douglas Brinkley.
Well, I'm very pleased to be with you.
Yes, indeed, Doug. Thank you for coming on again. And in
Anytime.
reading all the articles and obituaries on Jimmy Carter in the major newspapers, there was very little about his performance in the area of consumer protection, which means, in effect, his work with the regulatory agencies and the people he appointed to enhance the health, safety, and economic well-being of the American people. I found that rather strange, especially since I made a lot of calls trying to urge reporters to cover his consumer area. I was astonished one day during the campaign of Carter in 1976 to get a call from a reporter who said, "You know what Jimmy Carter just said?" I said, "No." He said he wants to outdo you as a consumer advocate, and he wants to take your recommendations as to who he should appoint to head these consumer regulatory agencies. I said to myself, what? It's not something before or after that I was accustomed to. I thought it was just campaign rhetoric, and it turned out not to be the case. He meant what he said. He accepted our invitation right after he was elected to address a huge ballroom of civic advocates in a hotel in Washington, and no one's ever done that before or since. And then he proceeded to nominate many of the people that I would have recommended to head the Federal Trade Commission, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Auto Safety Agency, and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the best nominees to date. So he meant what he said. And most prominently, he took a stand against the biggest lobbying effort that corporations have ever mounted against the consumer bill. This one was to establish a consumer protection agency to intervene before other federal agencies and make them pay attention to the consumer interests in their deliberations and proposals. And if they were arbitrarily not doing that, they could take these federal agencies to court. This was a structural, institutionalized proposal, and he supported it all the way. Unfortunately, too many of his Democrats in the Congress voted against the agency, and it was narrowly defeated. But I wanted to ask you, because you poured through all kinds of archives and materials in writing your Jimmy Carter book that nobody reached, if you could comment on his work in this area.
He was a very great admirer of Ralph Nader. you had, by the early 1970s, really had a movement going around the country about consumer activism and advocacy and awareness, and Carter was in your camp. Part of it was he saw that he had a distrust of big corporations and really big politics of Washington. And he wanted to have a people's movement, that people were aware of their rights. And so you were one of those people. William O. Douglas was another that he just admired. And, you had political clout in 1976, and your message was getting across. And Carter wanted to adopt what you were doing and integrate it into his White House, and he did. But the bigger problem at the end of the line for him was what you just said. There weren't enough Democrats to back what Carter was trying to do. I mean, you started losing on that issue everybody from Ted Kennedy liberals and Muskies of the world to Scoop Jackson in Washington. He couldn't build the Democratic Party that could push forward a very righteous idea which emanated from you.
It is amazing how he lost support among his Democrats. He couldn't even get the congressman from the Plains, Georgia district in Georgia, a Democrat, to vote for the Consumer Protection Agency. In the last 18 months of his term, he was really overwhelmed by Paul Volcker's high interest rates to try to tame down a spiraling inflation. And there was the Iranian hostage crisis that went on for a year and was prominently noticed by CBS. Walter Cronkite, every night at the end of his session, he would mention it. And he was under great pressure to deregulate natural gas, which he finally did, and lost his base more and more in Congress. So it's amazing that he did not interfere with either Joan Claybrook, who he appointed as head of the Auto Safety Agency, or Michael Perchik, who appointed chair of the Federal Trade Commission, or Doug Kossel, who appointed head of the Environmental Protection Agency. The ultimate tragedy was when Ronald Reagan came in. He dismantled these agencies. He put in toadies for business interests. The level of enforcement went way down, and even tore off 32 solar panels that Jimmy Carter put on the White House roof as a punctuation for his desire to convert our economy to renewable energy. Did he ever criticize these Democrats?
Yeah, he liked very few of them. When he came in, Ralph, in January of 1977, he said the Democratic Party is an albatross around my neck. And he did not care for the liberal wing, the Muskie Kennedy wing, or the Washington Scoop Jackson. He had some fondness for a little bit for Gaylord Nelson and Frank Church. He should have been able to get a little closer to Church. They had a lot in common. He was very close, Jimmy Carter, to Idaho's Secretary of Interior, Cecil Andrus. And that was a very effective relationship, Carter and Andrus, because they were able to do quite a bit with public lands, culminating largely in the Big Alaska, December 19, right before he left office in 1980. But the Southern Democrats that voted for Carter in 1976 in the Senate because of he's a fellow Southerner, they abandoned him. They wanted nothing to do with him. And it started really with the Panama Canal. And they started distancing themselves and saying, I'm not a Carter Democrat. The national news media making fun of Jimmy Carter, his accent. The Washington Post did not like him because Katharine Graham and Ben Bradley really mocked Carter. They were very much more involved with the Kennedy wing of the Democratic Party. And, he didn't really make a lot of friendships along the way in his presidency. He worked hard, Ralph, from beginning of all day long to the end of the day. If he had a dinner, it would eat, and then he'd say, I got to get back to work. And he wasn't worried about cultivating Washington relationships. Now, there are individuals in America he became very close to. Andy Young, his ambassador to the United Nations, but that's because Carter's the one that told Andy Young to meet with the Palestinian leadership in New York. And it blew up that it was secretly done by Andy Young. And Young kind of took the sword for Jimmy Carter. It resigned, but that came directly from Carter. And Carter knew that Young could have turned on him, and it didn't. And admired Young, and they became friends from Georgia on issues of human rights and civil rights and beyond. And then later in life, he had a few tight friends, particularly Ted Turner, who doesn't get talked about, the founder of CNN. Is Turner created the Jimmy Carter that everybody's honoring of the post-presidency, because when Carter would go to Sudan or would go to Chile or go to China, he would send a CNN crew to follow ex-President Carter and get a report on the news. And that helped open stories up that weren't getting covered in the national news. And of course, as you know, Ted Turner gave his famous big gift of $1 billion, I believe, to the United Nations. And then he bought all this land, public lands. And Carter liked that land environment conservation issue. He had a very easy hand at that because he really, we call him a farmer, a peanut farmer, but he knew agricultural science and became a first-rate conservationist, understanding botany and cycles of planting. And it interests me, Ralph, that same little belt where Carter's from, you can do a short drive to Tuskegee Institute, where the famous George Washington Carver was known as the Peanut Man, for all of the agronomic innovations and regenerative farming. And Carter fell into that quite early, and was very progressive, a thinker on how to feed the world and issues like that, and how to save public lands, have clean air, clean water. To be honest, Ralph, I don't know if anybody's already told you this, there's a lot of Carter and yourself have a lot of similarities in my mind, in the sense that you both work tirelessly and are brilliant and learn the nuts and bolts of an issue, and you lean into it. And both of you are known for your integrity and your honesty and your diligence and your duty. The question then becomes, where did Carter fail? And it's about media and about power within the Democratic Party. Those two things Carter couldn't conquer. The media stayed on his case. They blew up a killer rabbit coming after him. Rabbits, when a hunting dog chases a rabbit, they go to the pond and they swim to save their lives. There was nothing really extraordinary going on with the rabbit in a pond, but somebody got a photo and it became a killer rabbit incident. Billy Carter was put on the front page of the Washington Post for Billygate for weeks on end. Jimmy Carter had nothing to do with Billy.
Well, Doug, I've just written a column, which I'm trying to get placed, called Jimmy Carter Was My Last President. And by that I meant he was my last president, and I believe he was the last president for Progressive Civic Group as well, because he was the last president to actively open up the federal government to engagement and participation by long politically excluded American activists. He did this actively. He took our calls. No president since has done that. He met in the White House to discuss issues. No president since has done that. And that's what I think has been missing in a lot of the coverage. He really believed in a democratic society, and he believed it in terms of his behavior. The important thing we have to remember is how the people of America elected a man like Jimmy Carter, who was a Renaissance man, who wrote, who thought, who talked about realities, talked about peace, talked about renewable energy, and on and on. And the same people and their children have narrowly elected Donald Trump, who couldn't be more different than Jimmy Carter. The differences are staggering, just staggering. Jimmy Carter was in the Navy, and Donald Trump was a draft dodger. Jimmy Carter was humble. He was not greedy. He dealt with facts, not lies. Jimmy Carter treated his employees well, in contrast to the treatment of Donald Trump's employees. And he had to be sued by the lawyers for 500 undocumented Polish workers on his construction site because he didn't pay them what they were expecting to get paid. Carter tried to get the best out of people as a leader, and Trump is going overboard to try to bring out the worst out of people. The treatment of women couldn't be more different. Carter was about as honest as presidents come, and we have a convicted felon and a fugitive from justice on many other indicted cases that he's getting away with. The question I want to ask you as a historian is, how can the voting public vote for someone like Jimmy Carter as president and then turn around and vote for somebody like Donald Trump or Ronald Reagan, for that matter, because Reagan set the pace for turning our government over to big business. What's going on here? Let's set aside the Electoral College issue for a moment and ask you, as a historian, how can these waves be so drastically different?
In addition, Ralph, to some of the differences between Donald Trump and Jimmy Carter you just mentioned, we are now looking at Trump trying to undo Carter's Panama Canal Treaty, Jimmy Carter's saving of 100 million acres out in the West, and Trump wants to drill, baby, drill. You're looking at him being an aggressive territorial person, Trump, who's threatening countries ranging from Denmark to undermine NATO and Canada. They're just very different people. I once asked Donald Trump when I was working for CNN, my only time I met him, about other presidents. And when I got to Carter, he said he's not my cup of tea, and then proceeded to tell me that he never understood how Carter could be president because he thought he was so terrible. And then Trump said that one day he was going on radio shows, Trump, on Howard Stern and the like back in those days, and he was mocking Carter. One day he got a telephone call that President Carter wanted to meet him. He's coming to New York and wanted to see him. And he was convinced that Carter was going to ask him why he talked so terribly about him on the public airwaves. Instead, Carter walked in and started telling Donald Trump about guinea worm disease and river blindness and the need for free and fair elections and democracy, and asked Trump to donate to the Carter Center. And Trump told me that moment, now I saw how the guy became president, that he, even though I was just trashing him, he had the temerity to come and look me right in the eye and ask for that. And I saw how he rose above the pack in 1976 and won. And my only follow-up was, well, did you give Carter any money for those programs? And he said no. Jimmy Carter was trying to stay alive to vote for Kamala Harris, and he was able to by postal. He was really concerned about where things are headed with Trump. But I think the big story you're asking is about what your work, Ralph, and Rachel Carson and others about regulating corporations in the 1960s and early 70s was so successful, and the people's movement was upon us, and there was win after win, that you started getting that, it gets back to that famous Lewis Powell memo, which said, look, these regulators that are, or in their minds, people left center or even socialist, and using, as you by name, that we're about 40 years. We're going to have to build a pro-corporate, anti-regulatory movement. We're going to have to create our own Fox News and right-wing radio. We're going to have to start influencing universities on faculty hires. We're going to have to create our own lecture bureaus. And out of that becomes the birth of the Cato Institute, the Heritage Foundation, American Enterprise Institute, the Koch brothers, Scapy brothers. The list is so long, all aimed at undoing, I just call it Carsonism and Naderism, environment and consumer action. And they started, Carter was able to, it didn't affect 76 yet what they were doing, but the mobilization really began around 1970, 71, and 2. But by the time Reagan won in 80, they were able to have 12 years of Republican rule with Reagan and then Bush 41, and started looking to find ways to dismantle EPA. Jimmy Carter created a Department of Education. They started aiming how to reform that or do away with parts of it. They even were looking at, Carter created FEMA for emergencies, and there became an effort, as you saw by the time George W. Bush got FEMA, there was nothing left. But Mike Brown was an Arabian horse dealer running FEMA, who knew nothing about emergency operations. They were undermining the trophy wins of the Great Society and Rachel Carson and Ralph Naderism. And it's just kept going because money and the corporate money that goes into the oil and gas industry. And it's been a fight. And so somebody like Carter is almost like, you have to go back to somebody of like a Dwight Eisenhower. And I don't mean in a political term of just integrity of purpose and trying to operate out of a code of honor. And that's an older style. And now it's about who can do media manipulation, In the 60s, there was a radical movement to change government. Today, we're seeing the consumers having a radical indifference. We had 20 million less voters this last election than when Biden ran against Trump and beat him. There's public apathy, and I think COVID contributed to that people didn't trust the federal government at all. And now you're seeing Trump wanting to come in and undermine even more of programs that actually help the people, and instead are coming in with programs that help the corporations.
Well, I think we're heading in far more trouble than even some of the pessimists are writing about. I think we have seen on November 5th a slim majority, 230,000 vote difference in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania gave Trump the electoral votes he needed. That's how narrow the margin was. And they elected a Führer. They elected a wannabe dictator. They elected a person who lies, who creates fantasies, who makes phony promises that he knows he has no intention of fulfilling, and who basically says, I'm going to be a dictator on day one. Well, on day one, you're going to see a whole flurry of illegal executive orders that favor corporations and jeopardize ordinary people, workers, and consumers. And they will be violating federal statutes or the Constitution. And then he's off to the races, constantly dominating the news and distracting people from the realities of what they should expect the president to produce across the board. He's now allied himself with the people who want to sell off or give away the public lands, the national public lands. He's allied himself with people who want to strip the IRS further of budget, making Trump an aider and abetter of corporate tax evasion and evasion of taxes by the super wealthy, because the IRS wouldn't have the capacity and hasn't for years to get the specialists on board in order to investigate this. So I think we've got to be ready here for the most tumultuous dive into autocracy, even American-style fascism, in American history.
Has anybody in the U.S. Senate reached out to you in the Democratic Party on about how to create more modern-day consumer watchdog groups?
Just the opposite. They don't return calls. The big impediment to democracy now is something political scientists haven't studied, and that is that the elected people in Congress don't return calls to serious inquiries. They don't respond to serious letters. We put a lot of our letters in a report called the Incommunicados to show concretely how even our allies, ostensibly in Congress, don't even bother returning calls. That's Elizabeth Warren, Sherrod Brown, Bernie Sanders. We try to get them on our programs. We try to get them to respond to letters about what kind of congressional hearings they can pursue. We try to give them evidence. They don't even bother responding. And that's true for the way they're treating the whole civic progressive community in Washington, D.C., which at one time worked very closely with the Democratic Party in the 60s and 70s to get the great environmental, consumer, worker safety, freedom of information, and other legislation through Congress and through the White House. I'll just give you one quick example. We tried to wake up the Democratic Party last year because we saw the disaster coming. They weren't talking about New Deal, updated economic issues. The minimum wage increase was a throwaway line, and nobody believed them. They didn't connect on that. They didn't connect on full Medicare for all. They didn't connect on cracking down on corporate crooks, which comes in at 85-90% in the polls. They didn't connect on reversing the tax system and increasing taxes on the undertaxed super rich and multinational corporations. That comes in at 85% in the polls. That's a lot of left-right voters. That's a lot of conservative voters. So we proposed as a last-ditch effort a massive activity around Labor Day to have events all over the country through union and locals and civic groups to raise what we called a compact for American workers that would include minimum wage, health insurance, stronger labor organizing laws, pension reforms, etc., worker health and safety. We got the unions to say yes, but then they passed it by the Democratic National Committee and the Democratic Party, as they usually do. and they turned it down. They said, you shouldn't do this on Labor Day because we can't control what these events are going to turn into. Well, that kind of galvanizing would have brought out more votes, would have brought more voter registration in the succeeding 8 weeks, and would have changed the election. No doubt it would have changed the outcome of the election. So it was sabotaged by the Democratic Party apparatchiks. And the trouble is that the Democratic Party has contracted out its campaigns almost lock, stock, and barrel to these corporate conflicted consulting firms who make huge money off TV ads, commissions, and don't like ground game voter turnout because they don't get their 15% commission. They also raise the money for these candidates, and you would think that the media would have done investigative work on these consultants, maybe 300 phone calls and more emails from yours truly couldn't get them to do one article to New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, or AP. So I'm sorry to belabor all this, but you have to get down to...
Start with you. Was it when you ran, did that kind of shutdown start in 1992? What about like President Biden? How has your relationship with him been over the years?
Well, the 2000 Green Party campaign with my presidential effort was the major scapegoat that pulled down the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, every time it loses to the worst Republican Party in history, doesn't look at itself in the mirror and engage in introspection. It looks for scapegoats. And the scapegoats of the era is the Green Party because of the Electoral College. So Joe Biden became an adversary. And he said after Bush was selected, George W. Bush was selected by the Supreme Court, he went on TV and he said, Ralph Nader better not come up here on Capitol Hill anymore. Instead of all the sine qua nons that Al Gore knows cost him the election. He won the popular vote over Bush, and the Electoral College threw it into Florida, as we know, and all the shenanigans of Jeb Bush and his state secretaries with excluding people as ex-felons when they weren't ex-felons, and the hanging chads and the deceptive ballots, and then the Supreme Court decision led by the Republicans stopping the Florida Supreme Court order to have a full state recount. And what do? They blame the Greens. Well, you know what I would do? When I was running, I would give my entire agenda to the Democrats and Republicans, say, here, take it, poll it. See how beautifully it polls. And they wouldn't do it. And that was true for John Kerry in 2004 as well. So scapegoating and not looking at their own failures, as James Carville and others have pointed out, has been destroying the Democratic Party, as well as those corporate conflicted consulting firms who run their campaigns.
Have you been asked by the Democrats to testify since 2000 election?
That's a very good point. I used to be asked all the time. I think I testified 2 or 3 times in the last 25 years, when I used to testify numerous times every year. But it isn't just me. They haven't had the hearings when they controlled the House and Senate. The Democrats haven't had the hearings that would have prominently invited national civic leaders, the heads of Common Cause, of Public Citizen, of People for American Way, Center for Science and Public Interest, Pension Rights Center. They've all been excluded because the Democrats have become a corporate party and money has gushed into them. They raise more money often than the Republicans do. Hillary Clinton raised far more money than Donald Trump, and Biden raised huge amounts of money against Donald Trump from Wall Street, and so did Barack Obama. So we're dealing with extremely serious chapters in American history unfolding here, and we've all got to pick up the oars and stop saying the rest is commentary. Well, thank you. We've been talking with Doug Brinkley, professor of history at Rice University and author of many books on presidents and other topics. Is there any last thing you'd like to say to our serious listeners?
That my one issue, because everything you cover is so broad-based, and I'm trying to focus on environmental issues personally, on looking at how to keep America rivers truly clean, our lakes, going after corporate polluters, trying to find and get data and information about companies that are making us unhealthy across the United States. And so I think if everybody has some interest and just could get going in one area that touches them, that they have spare time, you'll get a mobilization because the country's got a kind of poison going on around the land, and you've articulated kind of a lot to be awake about right now. It's not a time to bury your head in TikTok or just to watch sports.
Well said, Doug Brinkley. You've etched one of the great omnicides coming fast to the planet Earth. It's not just climate disruption, it's the contamination of the very natural background that makes survival possible for the human race and the natural world. And you've hit on something very important. That's where a major point of resistance will come against Donald Trump, who thinks climate disruption is a hoax and wants to drill for more oil, gas, and coal. So I'm glad you're working on that. And the younger people have been educated through you and others about ecology, about the environment. And so we have people that really are concerned on climate issues. It's just how does one organize against this new destruction of the public lands that Trump's going to try to oversee in a way that even James Watt of Ronald Reagan days wouldn't have imagined. Well, the message to Trump will be sent by virulent fires, wildfires, hurricanes, droughts, floods, rising sea level near Mar-a-Lago. He'll get the message sooner or later. The question is, do we continue escalating our collective response on the climate crisis, or are we looking at a 4-year reversal into the dark recesses of the fossil fuel industry? With that said, thank you very much for your time, Doug.
Thank you, Ralph. You take care.
Yes. Bye-bye now.
We've been speaking with Douglas Brinkley. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, we'll speak to James Fallows about the magic of Jimmy Carter. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, January 10, 2025. I'm Russell Mokhiber. The Department of Transportation has fined JetBlue $2 million for operating multiple chronically delayed flights. The penalty marks the first time the DOT has fined an airline for chronic flight delays, a prohibited, unrealistic scheduling practice. Half of the penalty is going to compensate JetBlue customers affected by the airline's chronic delays. Illegal chronic flight delays make flying unreliable for travelers, the department said. The department's rules prohibit airlines from promising unrealistic schedules that do not reflect actual flight departure and arrival times. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Hannah Feldman, along with David Feldman and Ralph. When James Fallows joined Jimmy Carter's presidential campaign in 1976, he saw an earnest, intense, no-frills Carter as offering the American people the prospect of healing, renewing, fulfilling the best in our national ideals. Now let's speak to James Fallows about Carter's brief time in office and his lifetime of public service. David?
James Fallows is a contributing writer at The Atlantic and author of the newsletter Breaking the News. He began writing for the magazine in the mid-1970s, reporting from China, Japan, Southeast Asia, Europe, and across the United States, and he has written hundreds of articles for the publication since then. He's also worked as a public radio commentator, a news magazine editor, and for 2 years, he was President Jimmy Carter's chief speechwriter. He is the author of 12 books, including Who Runs Congress with Mark Green and David Zwick, The Water Lords, Bringing the News, How the Media Undermine American Democracy, and Our Towns, a 100,000-mile journey into the heart of America with Deborah Fallows. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, James Fallows.
Thanks so much. And the first two books in my lineage were both under the auspices of the person we're about to hear from.
Well, listeners should know that at age 20, before he even finished Harvard University, Jim Fallows was head of a task force that we sent down to the Savannah River area, and he wrote a book on the polluters of the Savannah River called The Water Lords, which is a beautifully written book and foreshadowed his many writings in the coming years. Jim Fallows, in 1976, we shared some time with Jimmy Carter down in Plains, Georgia. He was the nominee for the party. It was during the summer, August, I believe, and Jimmy Carter invited me down, and you and I sat in his study for several hours, and I'd like you to describe Jimmy Carter and what we discussed.
Yes, those were the days. So it's a great honor to talk with you again, Ralph. We've been comrades and colleagues for many, many decades now. So in the spring of 1976, so just a bit of background, my wife, Deb, whom you know very well, Ralph, was in graduate school at the University of Texas in Austin. I was working for the Texas Monthly magazine and working as an assistant to a then very young state senator named Lloyd Doggett, who has been, for decades now, the representative from Central Texas. And since I had no steady work, I joined up on the Carter campaign. So I was based in Atlanta, and on a August weekend, I believe in 1976, Carter was having you come in to counsel him on the kind of reform agenda he should undertake. So with Deb flew from Austin to Atlanta. We all drove down from there to Plains. I don't remember exactly which vehicles, which of us were transported by, but we were there in the same house where Jimmy and Rosalind Carter lived through, all their subsequent decades. We sat in their sort of living room or dining room. I think Rosalind Carter was bringing us iced tea, and you were talking with Jimmy Carter about ways in which government could do things for the people, which the message of the book I'd worked on you second, the Who Runs Congress book with Mark Green and David Swick, ways in which Congress, the power of money could be removed from Congress, in which citizens could be empowered, in which environmental policy, which had been a big part of Carter's time as governor in Georgia, it could be advanced. So he listened to you, and I was taking notes during that time. And you were famously the umpire of the softball game that afternoon, wearing a suit, probably the only umpire ever to be wearing a business suit while behind the plate with Jimmy Carter on the mound.
Or batting.
Yes.
Yeah. What struck me about that meeting with him, and you were with us at the time, the intense concentration on the discussion and what we were saying. He was taking notes himself, copious notes, and it went on for 2 to 3 hours. And I said to myself, I've never experienced anything like this. I've just written a column, Jim, called Jimmy Carter Was My Last President. He was the last president to open the doors in government to participation. As you know, he nominated sterling advocates to head the Federal Trade Commission, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Auto Safety Agency. He meant what he said, and I was pretty astonished. And no president, Democrat, Republican, since has come close to opening government to civic groups to both participate, petition, have discussions. He'd take calls from the White House when we wanted to reach him. And I got a flavor of that in Plains. Then you became his speechwriter. Why don't you describe what life was like? Because you were a speechwriter for someone who was a voracious reader, turned out to be a voracious author of some 32 books, and was very literate and couldn't be more contrasting with the incoming President Donald Trump in a whole variety of ways, intellectual, normative, result-oriented, and the like. What was it like to be a speechwriter?
Yes, and I won't even get started down the path of comparisons between leadership now and leadership under Carter. I'll say that Carter, I think, intellectually proud people, of whom Carter was one, they sort of resent the idea that speechwriters exist. Because one reason is they think if they had time, they would do a better job themselves. Certainly that was famously Barack Obama's approach, that he thought the best speechwriter of all was himself. Bill Clinton famously also ad-libbed part of a State of the Union address when the teleprompter failed. And Jimmy Carter, part of the reason, as you recall, Ralph, that he became president at all, going from 1% name recognition at the beginning of 1976 to being sworn in the beginning of 1977, was precisely because of that magical impression he left on people in small settings like the one that you and I had with him in their modest house in Plains, to all these crowds of 200 or 300 people across Iowa, and then famously Iowa, but also then the other primary states, where he was able extemporaneously to look with those piercing eyes and smile his big smile and have his combination of being an engineer and somebody who liked poetry and history, who was a Naval Academy graduate but was against the Vietnam War and called it a racist war, who was a child of the white South, but also put Martin Luther King's portrait in the Georgia State Capitol, et cetera. He had this ability himself to connect directly. And so it was difficult, and I'll just to sort of bring this to actually answer your question, of the different tiers of presidential speechwriting, there's the extemporaneous part, which Carter excelled at. And I think a modern example might be Pete Buttigieg, who has always works the stump in impressive ways. Then on the other extreme is the big formal address, a State of the Union address, a UN address, or something like that. And the latter kind of performance requires a performance skill. It's not just speaking off the cuff. You have to learn how to act in a way. I think Carter always somewhat thought that was a kind of pomp and artifice that he shouldn't need. And so it was, most of the notes I have from Carter on drafts contained in the marginalia is in the theme of very poor, can't you do better, this needs more humor, et cetera. So it was, I think the common lore among people who worked on his speechwriting staff in particular was that he was a much easier person to admire than to work for. But I've greatly admired him.
Unlike the speechwriters for Reagan, because he delivered the speech, but he allowed them to write the speeches for him. LBJ with Dick Goodwin. But then you had other duties. You actually drafted some of the executive orders, did you not?
Yes. So I was working, as you know, Ralph, and you were in the center of the deregulatory movement that was going on there. So I worked with Alfred Kahn, of Cornell economist, on airline deregulation. And so somebody needs to actually hammer out the official statement saying this is going to happen. So in airline deregulation, I worked with Alfred Kahn on that. Trucking deregulation, I forget who was at the center of that, but Stu Eisenstadt certainly is head of his domestic policy group. And then my own particular interest has been making the craft beer movement possible by deregulating home brewing. When Carter took office, there were only like 5 or 6 breweries in the U.S. After Prohibition, the industry had become concentrated in these giant industrial scale breweries, Anheuser-Busch, et cetera. And so now there are 4,000 or 5,000, which are startups around the country. And the whole arguments about the role of alcohol in American life, et cetera. But in terms of letting a new industry flourish, I was part of writing it, typing out those actual orders.
That's a nice footnote to history here. We're talking with James Fallows. Tell us about what you think is coming January 20. Voters voted in Jimmy Carter. He couldn't have been more different than Donald Trump. I have a list of 25 areas where he's different, right down to he paid his taxes. Unlike Donald Trump, he released his medical records. Unlike Donald Trump, he expanded the public lands, and Donald Trump wants to sell them off. He respected women, and need more be said about Donald Trump. He tried to observe the law, and Donald Trump unabashedly says he is the law. Jimmy Carter was full of peace talk, and Donald Trump's full of violent talk, deals with fantasies, exudes falsehoods and lies, is self-enriching, just the opposite of the more humble Jimmy Carter. Carter was a reader, a writer, an author. He was skilled in so many areas, an accomplished woodworker, fly fisherman. He obviously knew a lot about peanut farming. He had a whole variety of skills as well. So the difference, and yet the voters have narrowly voted in Donald Trump for a second term. What are your forebodings, if we may use that term?
Well, let me first take the high road, prompted by something you said. Something I hadn't realized about Jimmy Carter, even though I'd worked for him long ago and been an associate over the years, was that when he was asked during the 76 campaign what was his favorite book, he replied it was Let Us Now Praise Famous Men by James A.G. and photos by Walker Evans. And there's a wonderful article in the new edition of Harvard Magazine by my friend Lincoln Kaplan. There's a non-paywalled link people can see at Harvard Magazine about how Jimmy Carter sort of embraced the poetry, both literary and visual, of that book. For people who don't know, this was a book that was produced during the Depression when James A.G., who became a famous writer and died tragically young, was spending time in rural Alabama, with Depression-era families. And Walker Evans, one of the famed New Deal photographers, was taking pictures of these families. And it was sort of a portrait of the South in which Jimmy Carter grew up. Say one other side note before coming back to future prospects. The event that kicked off the 1976 campaign was held in Warm Springs, Georgia, in Carter's home state. That, of course, is where Franklin Roosevelt died and where he had gone for polio rehabilitation. And Jimmy Carter was talking about, he was kicked off the campaign there for two reasons. One was the legacy of FDR, of government as an active friend of the public, as opposed to this, what we later heard it portrayed by Reagan or Newt Gingrich or whatever. The other was that he had the crowd remember what it was like when FDR brought electricity to their communities in Georgia with the Rural Electrification Administration. And most of the crowd, like Carter, remembered the time before and after they had electric power in their communities. So he was somebody who spanned historical eras, and he had a range of interests. He appreciated one of the seminal books of American cultural history, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, and a great writer and photographer. As for what is ahead, I've heard your previous segment with Douglas Brinkley, and I think what you were saying as the path ahead is consistent to what I have heard you say, starting with when, as a college student in the late 1960s, I first heard you give speeches and was part of your early teams then, which is that the only answer is continued engagement at the citizen level, at the voter level, at the protester level, at the community improvement level, that is the only leverage that is left. The institutions that at various times have risen to the challenge and met the moment, the Supreme Court, the institutionalized Republican Party, much of the mainstream media, they are not meeting this moment in flagrantly obvious ways. And there is no alternative of giving up or moving away or saying, well, I'm not going to pay attention. The only alternative is the long, conscious effort and struggle. And I'll filibuster in one other way if I could. I was telling somebody the morning after this latest election that for me, as a boomer era white American, I had a modest family background, but I've had a privileged education and subsequent life. I was saying that the conscious reelection of Donald Trump was, to my mind, in my situation, the worst thing that had happened to the United States in my lifetime, worse than the Vietnam War, because it was a conscious decision. And many of my Black friends said, don't get us started. You know, this is the story of the United States over the centuries. And the Black example has been, you cannot give up. This is Frederick Douglass. This is Martin Luther King. This is, Senator Warnock in Georgia right now. And I think that is the example for Americans in general. I think that the contest is going to be between incompetence and malevolence in the administration ahead.
And we should remember that our principal instrument is the U.S. Congress under the Constitution. And
Yes.
That's where all that grassroots effort you mentioned, Jim, can focus on. And well, as being a co-author of the most popular book ever written on Congress, Who Runs Congress. It sold more books than any other book ever written on Congress. Those were the good old days. In just a few minutes we have left, I want to give Hannah and David a chance just to ask you a question.
You write that he was hands-on when it came to his speeches. The Reagan mythology is that Reagan knew how to delegate while Carter trusted nobody. He micromanaged the White House until it suffocated. Is that true?
Basically, yes. And I think it's because, with Reagan, I'll say one distinction that matters to me in the speechwriting realm, people think what matters was his experience as an actor. I think what actually mattered for Reagan's experience in office was his experience as an announcer. He is somebody who had been a radio personality. He knew how to deliver speeches well. He had the GE radio hour, et cetera, et cetera. Jimmy Carter, for better and worse, had zero national politics experience. That was part of what made him seem refreshing. That's part of why Hunter S. Thompson wrote this adulatory piece about him in Rolling Stone after his Law Day speech in 1974. But Carter, I think one of his limitations in office was that he didn't know what he didn't know in various realms. This happens to all of us. That's why many outsiders struggle in their first term as president. And so I think, yes, he felt as if he could be in command of many things. And I think if he had a second term, he would have been more effective, as Barack Obama was and others have been. So, yes, I think that stereotype is largely true.
It is amazing his efficient use of time, both when he was president and most famously his 40-some years as a former president. Haven't you been amazed by how much he accomplished? I mean, just day after day, the productivity was startling. I often thought that should have been his 33rd book.
Yes, yes, indeed. And I had the opportunity about 2 months ago at some event where Jimmy Carter was being honored with the Dayton Literary Peace Prize to talk with two of his grandsons, Joshua Carter and Jason Carter. Jason, the former politician in Georgia, Joshua, a very eloquent speaker. And we were talking about one of the most remarkable things was, again, these books, 32, 33 books he had put out. And as I said to Jason Carter, I said, and they were actually good. And Jason said back, I guess you didn't read his poetry. And so but it was the voice he had that was sometimes not right for giving a State of the Union address or a UN address, really became distinctive. He showed that in his first public book, Why Not the Best, which was his campaign autobiography. Joshua Carter pointed out that he wrote a book before that, which was a manual on submarine operation for the Navy. But he really had a distinctive voice, and he was an election monitor. And he dealt with the guinea worm, and he was a carpenter, and he did these millions of other things, and he preached Sunday school nearly every Sunday. And so he was a phenomenal example. Stories are how we understand the world. Let us hope that Jimmy Carter's stories stand as some counterweight to the stories we're swamped with now.
Well said. His indefatigable travels abroad, monitoring elections, going into hot spots, still negotiating for arrangements. He tended to bring the best out of people, and Trump tends to bring the worst out of people, which is an important marker in evaluating a political leader of such magnitude as the President of the United States is. Hannah?
My question is about how the heck Jimmy Carter got elected in the first place. He seems like the embodiment of an outsider really working for the people and the exact kind of candidate that the establishment of the Democratic Party and broader Washington politics simply would not allow to succeed. What do you think it was that made that difference with him?
So 2 years ago, when Jimmy Carter went into hospice, and there were a number of pre-obituaries written about him that he had the benefit of being able to read over the next 2 years, and they were mainly admiring, I wrote a piece for him, which I can send you a link to, called Unlucky President, Lucky Man. And it was about the role of luck in various ways in his life. It's worth remembering what a dark and terrible time that was in the United States. The fall of Saigon was just a few months before the Iowa caucuses were held. The Watergate traumas were, of course, very recently in mind. The beginning of historic inflation was underway. There were tensions every place you looked on Earth. And so it was time ripe for, there was more legitimate reason for just shaking up everything in 1976 than there was now by any measurable indication. Carter had good luck in people who chose to run for him or against him. He had the good luck that Hunter S. Thompson, again, as I mentioned, covered him in Rolling Stone for a historic speech that Carter gave on Georgia Law Day when he was governor, essentially saying that law had become the servant of power rather than the servant of the people. And so that was a part of his being seen as a bridge figure, black and white, pro and against war, rock music and country music and gospel music, of being able to run as a evangelical figure, a born-again figure just before the moral majority became as politicized as it was, to carry his native South. He carried all of the old Confederacy except for the state of Virginia in the general election. And so I think that a lot of things went his way, and he had the strategy too of figuring out the Iowa caucuses. He was the first person to see the Iowa caucuses. So it was partly strategy, mainly luck. Luck then worked against him, and he turned in his favor after he left office. That's my long answer.
In Hannah, he had this introduction of himself that listed all of his roles. His nuclear engineer, peanut farmer, this and that. And most politicians don't go into their different specialized roles that he thought qualified himself to become president. I remember, Jim, he would have this habit whenever there were business conventions in Atlanta. This was during and after governor of Georgia. He would ask to give an introductory remarks. And so people from all over the country that went to these business conventions in Atlanta would hear him week after week. I remember once sitting in the audience, and he had that 4-minute presentation down with great precision and authenticity. Before we close, Jim, is there anything you'd like to tell our many serious listeners who are active in their communities?
So I guess I'm grateful for the chance to talk with you, Ralph, at this moment as we reflect on a president of the past and prepare for an administration of the future and the paths that you and I have traveled over those years. I'll say that there are people whose example lasts because they've been consistent over the decades. And I think you, Ralph, in the decades I've known you, that has been the case with you. I think it's the case of Jimmy Carter as well. And we can hope that for people who are consistent and true to themselves, there are times when fortune smiles in their favor, and there's times when fortune works against them, but their lasting example endures and can inspire others. So that is the thought with which I would close.
Well said. And that's what the week-long attention to Jimmy Carter's life can provide for younger generations, that there was a time when we had thoughtful presidents who spoke on behalf of the people, and they very much need those kinds of yardsticks in the coming weeks and months under the Trump administration. Thank you very much, Jim.
My pleasure, Ralph. It's always wonderful to talk with you and all of your team.
I want to thank our guests again, Douglas Brinkley and James Fallows. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel, and for Ralph's weekly column, you can get it for free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
The American Museum of Tort Law has gone virtual. Go to tortmuseum.org to explore the exhibits, take a virtual tour, and learn about iconic tort cases from history.
To order your copy of the Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, go to capitolhillcitizen.com. The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. And more than ever, it's going to be necessary for you to become Capitol Hill citizens. The Congress is the last stand against a Trump dictatorship.
I'm only trying to school you.